Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to Creative Insights. I'll open with karakia and then we'll move on to introductions for our wonderful panelists and speakers today. Kēnō tātou. Tu tawa mai I runga, tu tawa mai I raro, tu tawa mai I roto, tu tawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te mauri tū. Te mauri ora ki te katoa. Homie, huie, kai kie. Welcome to Creative Insights. This is a series of online hui presented by Auckland Council and Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi, which aim to make creative research more accessible, relatable and relevant. In this third session, we'll be looking at the insights from the creative sector funding case study that explores funding intersections and interrelationships in the creative sector across Tāmaki Makaurau. First up, we have Kat Dornier from Tū who'll present the key insights and challenges within the funding ecosystem that has surfaced during these interviews. Then our three panelists will expand on the information shared in the case studies and discuss future opportunities for collaboration across the creative sector. We'll end the session with a Q&A, and for this we ask you submit your comments and questions within the chat. Whilst the webinar is being recorded, we'll keep the Q&A nice and tight in the room. That won't be shared. And before we kick off, please just introduce yourself in the chat so we can get an idea of who's with us today. And then we will move to some introductions. Kia ora, ko Kylie Sealy tōku ingoa. I'm here on behalf of Auckland Council and Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi today, sort of hosting and guiding you through this process. Discussion, there we go, not a process. And I'll kick off with our panelists. Let's go alphabetical. Amber, I'll start with you.
Tēnā rā tātou katoa, e mihi ana ki a koutou I tēnei ata. Tēnā koe Kylie, tō karakia, kia tūwhera pai tā tātou kōrero I tēnei rā. Kia ora everyone, my name is Amber Corrine. I'm one of the leaders of Te Pō Theatre and I'm beaming in from the whenua of Te Atiawa in Taranaki. Been here at Te Matasini and enjoying every moment of it. Ngā mihi nui ki Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi for this important work and then weaving us all together to have kōrero about it and to make this research, usable, knowable, accessible. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora. Debs, I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora. Tēnā tātou katoa, ko Debs Smith tōku ingoa, no Airani, no Kotirani o ki whānau. Ko au te kaiwhakahari o te tēma mahi haumi I Toi Aotearoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Debs Smith, my pronouns are she, her. I have fair skin, long blonde hair, and I'm wearing glasses, an emerald green top, and some pounamu earrings for Te Matatini, even though I cannot be there. My family hails from Ireland and Scotland way back in the mist of time, and I have the privilege of managing the investments team at Creative New Zealand Toi Aotearoa. Tēnā rā tātou.
Kia ora. And Kat, over to you.
Yeah. Kia ora, Kylie. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kat Dornier tōku ingoa, no Cheshire ahau, kei Tāmaki Makaurau tōku kāinga I Naenei. I'm Kat Dornier. I'm an independent consultant with an organisation, Tū. I'm really delighted to have been able to partner with Te Taumata Toi-a-Iwi, Auckland Council and Creative New Zealand to be the lead researcher on this piece of mahi, and very excited to be sharing the insights with those of you who made it today. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you all. Kat, we'll kick off with you with taking us through the presentation from the insights before we move to a discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Kylie. Hopefully everyone can see this presentation. So I'm just going to take you through some slides to help share the insights from the research that we've done. So starting off, give you a bit of background to what this piece of mahi was. So this piece of research was commissioned by the Auckland Arts Investors Forum, which is a network of regional and national funders that are investing into Tāmaki Makaurau, into the creative sector. They meet every couple of months to work on issues of shared interest and collaborate on particular projects around the funding ecosystem. There's an ongoing piece of research called Mapping the Creative Sector Investment and Outcomes that sits alongside this. That piece of research has been running consecutively for 4 years, which looks at all of the investment flows into Tāmaki Makaurau in terms of supporting the arts from the key investors that sit on that investors forum. This year, last year, the Investors Forum decided to do an extension piece to that research that looked more deeply at some case studies that would show the different roles that the funders are playing in that ecosystem. So not just where the money's going and the kind of outcomes that the funders are seeking, but from a creative organizations perspective, what's that funding doing? What different roles do the funders play? How interdependent are those different funding sources for organizations? What challenges they're having to navigate as organizations trying to access resourcing from that funding landscape. And from a community perspective, what does an effective funding partnership look like? So we can kind of build an understanding of that and hopefully start threading that through into strengthening our funding system so that the creative sector can thrive. So that's the sort of purpose. What we did was create some case studies through interviews with 6 organizations that were chosen because of their relationships with the funders in the Investors Forum, and that represented a diverse mix of art forms, size and scale, local, national, regional, and community participants. So the 6 organizations are listed there. And we created an individual case study for each organization that looks at what they do, how that's resourced, what particular unique challenges or issues they experience in putting that resourcing mix together. And from their point of view, what an enabling funding partnership might look like. So looking across the 6 case studies enabled us to get some broader insights, and that's the diagram there that shows the sort of themes of those that I'll walk through today. So we got some clarity on the sources of income that different groups are accessing. We got insights into outcome areas that are common across different organizations. So what are these organizations contributing to in terms of impact? We got quite deep insight into the financial challenges that organizations are experiencing, linked to the funding system itself and how that's working and not working for them. So the funding system issues are the broader kind of challenges that groups experience trying to access resourcing, and then the enabling funding partnerships are their views on what good relationships with funders look like. And that's usually informed by several relationships that they currently hold with funders. So the sources of income, this table sort of shows you that each organization puts together a different funding mix, and they're all quite broad. So organizations don't just rely on one source of funding, however, typically are over-reliant on one or more of these funders, and that's usually Creative New Zealand, Foundation North, or Auckland Council, mostly because of I guess the focus on arts and culture that those funders have, and or the size and scale of funding into the sector that they offer. All or most of the organizations received private donations, so that's direct money being given philanthropically to the organization. And they generate direct income, whether that's through ticket sales or contra or whatever that looks like for different organizations. All of them are accessing other grant funding, so not just those big 3 funders, but looking at gaming, trust lotteries, that kind of thing. Very few of them had access to central government funding and corporate sponsorship, and there's possibly a sense that you need a certain scale and visibility to access those sources of funding. You need resources to be able to tap into those funding spaces. Listed here are some of the common outcome areas that these groups were contributing towards, and they're quite broad, but it sort of shows the depth and breadth of what the creative sector is achieving in terms of impact in the community. So the first couple, producing high quality New Zealand arts and enabling public access to those arts, supporting community wellbeing through participation in the arts, quite a strong focus on enabling greater equity of access to arts and culture, supporting inclusion and more diverse representation within the arts. And for the groups that we spoke to, that was particularly the case for young people, people with disabilities, Māori, tangata moana. A couple of the organisations had quite a strong youth focus, so there was clear contribution to youth development outcomes, things like confidence, belonging, supporting youth wellbeing, connecting young people to their culture and to their communities, supporting career development and career pathways. Telling community narratives and storytelling was a key space, and supporting the exchange of cultural knowledge. That's both to organisation to audience or participants within, so the kind of in a diverse way. Supporting whānau and community connectedness, skills development and employment opportunities or employment pathways. Some are contributing to regional or more community-based economic development. And for the organisations themselves, often one of the outcomes that is enabled through the funding they received is their own organisational development. So to the nitty-gritty, the financial challenges is the first section of the sort of challenges that I'll walk through. So these are kind of common areas that were affecting these groups in terms of resourcing. So the first one is really just the current situation, the economic climate that we're in, the cost of living is making their organisational costs and overheads rise. In order to try and pay a living wage, groups need more resourcing. So the sort of wider societal pressures on the economy are playing out in organisations as well. That flows through into a volatile revenue for some of these organisations. So if communities are experiencing issues with cost of living, that impacts people's ability to participate in paid programs, to buy tickets, to be in audiences. So depending on the kind of arts organisation that we spoke to, that looked different, but generally speaking, the user pays element is impacted when the cost of living situation is as tricky as it currently is. All of the organisations are balancing the need to generate revenue with their own kind of social impact or purpose. So there's this balance that groups are having to meet between charging or doing free work versus to attract different audiences or diversify their reach or address their kind of inclusion aspirations. But that comes often at a cost of being able to charge, particularly in the current climate. We heard really clearly that COVID's still a thing, like it's the long tail of that is still impacting organisations. So those that have audiences, those are slow to return. Most organisations have had a major hit on their reserves to get through that tricky period. That also includes the things like the Auckland anniversary weekend floods as well. And some of the support systems around COVID recovery funding are coming to an end. So organisations that access that funding will experience quite a severe drop-off and if they want to continue any extended work that they started with that funding, then they need to find alternative sources. We heard from groups that in order to reach non-art specific funding streams, they have to be really good at articulating what their wider outcomes or impact is. And that's quite a skill set to be able to tell that story well. So that's a bit of a challenge for arts organisations also. So the next two slides go more into how the groups we spoke to experienced challenges or difficulties with the funding system itself. So this is more kind of like the processes and ways of being or the practice that most funders are adopting. And it's fair to say, as a preface to this, that some of those practices are constantly in flux and evolving, and many of the funders that these groups are funded by are working on these issues as we're discussing them. But, we're just kind of naming what they are here. So there's, I think, about 10 of these, so we'll work through them. The first one being just a general underfunding. So the level of demand versus the funding available is just a big mismatch. So there's actually just not enough funding to go around, which means that groups are being either partially funded or they're not able to increase their funding year by year to reflect inflation. And the flow-on effect of being under-resourced is that the organisations experience burnout and just broader well-being issues, that constant treadmill of trying to find funding when it's not there. There's also related to that a sort of a trend around funding insecurity, so a lack of opportunities for multi-year funding. So it's being on that annual funding treadmill rather than having that security of multi-year funding. Organisations are experiencing challenges with lower donations and funding loss in terms of sponsorship, and that's again flowing through from the cost of living squeeze and higher inflation, and also that some of that private donor demographic are aging, so perhaps moving on to other things or or aging out of being givers, unless they're leaving gifts in wills, then that's going to impact organizations. The burden of fundraising is a big issue. It's time intensive, it's resource intensive. There's often funders have competing deadlines without realizing. So you might have a big report due to one funder whilst you're also trying to do a big application to another. And that's really challenging for organizations that don't have a lot of resources. And just managing those funding relationships is quite a commitment, especially if they're strategic partnerships, if they're really important to the organization. The amount of time and energy you need to put into managing that is a thing, and it needs to be resourced. And the constrained funding environment, as we've sort of touched on already, the COVID funding's ending. There aren't really any major new sources of money. So from the funding system itself is finite. As that table showed, most funders have, although kind of a broad mix of funder, there's a skewed reliance on a few funders. So Creative New Zealand Foundation North, Auckland Council, to some extent gaming trusts are major sources of funding, and if one of those was to be cut or to be lost, then that's critical to the organization and leaves them really vulnerable. It's not just kind of like a scaling down situation for some organizations, it would be a folding situation. So it's really difficult. Government funding cuts aren't helping. So not necessarily in terms of creative sector funding, but more broadly when groups are accessing funding from other government departments, where that funding is cut, that's rolling through to some creative sector organizations, but also means that funders are having to kind of backfill places where government funding is cut, and that might be directing funding away from arts and culture. For the groups who have kind of focus on accessibility, there's a higher cost to producing work with those considerations, making venues accessible, for example, employing sign language support, that kind of thing. And there's actually no dedicated revenue streams for that, so it has to be kind of accommodated in the regular funding. There's no specific funding for those extra costs. Some of the groups we spoke to managed a venue, and for those groups, creating a sustainable business model for making that venue work is a real challenge. And perhaps Amber can speak a little bit to this in the discussion, but we need to look at different funding models for people with built infrastructure as part of their organisation. And there's a lack of unrestricted funding. So we heard that funding is very project-based. There's not that many options for operational costs or to support organizational development or governance development, things that support the organization to progress and even develop the skills to be able to diversify the funding mix. You know, you need support to be able to build that capability, and that stuff is hard to fund. So the more positive side of things is what enabling funding partnerships look like. And most of the groups had at least one partnership where they could really speak to funders going above and beyond and offering some of these things. And so the next two slides are really the kind of core things that groups want to see when they're working in relationship with funders. So the first one is multi-year funding, so that, you know, to provide long-term surety so that they can plan, they can retain staff, and to be able to have that be recurrent really reduces the time burden on having to apply for funding on that annual basis. The second is for funding to be flexible and to be focused on outcomes rather than outputs. So effectively saying to groups, you know what you need, spend the funding on what you need. We want to see outcomes at the end of that rather than a set number of activities delivered or people reached or that kind of thing. And then within that flexibility, so as and when things are being delivered and they change, that the fund is willing to roll with that and support the group to accommodate those changes. The third one is OPEX funding. So, you know, related to what was spoken to before, groups want wages and funding to cover core costs to enable them to do what they do. Not everything is tied up in a project, so it's much easier to deliver when those core things are funded. Groups spoke to wanting values alignment with their funders. So this sense of more of it being a reciprocal, trusting partnership rather than a funder-grantee relationship where there's like those kind of awkward power dynamics. And the last one on this slide is as applicant-centered funding processes. So making the actual process of applying for funding easier for organizations, streamlining the applications, making reporting easier, where possible, funders actually going out working with community to design what that looks like is really effective. And the last three on here, oops, I've got that one twice, pardon me. Funder brokering. So when you're working in partnership with a funder, but they can also broker relationships with other funders or access to non-funding opportunities that help to strengthen your organization or its ability to deliver. That's really valuable to groups. And lastly, the sector's looking for funders to be joined up, to collaborate, to have more joined up processes. So they're not having to do kind of 10 different applications. Maybe it's one or two to access multiple funding streams that are combined. And for funders to be quite strategic in terms of co-investing into key gaps. So if a group says, hey, in our space, this, and this is really missing, funders working collectively to kind of look at that and say, okay, what can we do to fill that gap? So that's me. Really rich insights from those 6 organizations. I feel like we could have spoken to another 20 and got a whole lot more, but the themes by and large would have been the same. And they're not particularly unique to the creative sector in many ways. There are some things that definitely are, but a lot of those things are quite broad to any organizations in the not-for-profit space, and I'll speak to that probably a little bit more in the panel discussion. But Kylie, I'll hand back over to you at this point. Thank you.
Kia ora. Huge thank you, Kat. That's I think there's something really valuable about framing that up as a collective response that we can see it across the sector, and also that separation, because I'm sure funders hear this from a lot of these things directly from creative sector organisations and practitioners, but to shape it as a piece of research, I think is really valuable. So thank you. We're going to move into a little bit of panel discussion for about 15 minutes here before we move into a Q&A. So Debs, I might start with you here. So how does this align with what you're already hearing from the sector, and how is it sort of influencing how Creative New Zealand is changing their approach?
Yeah, I mean, it aligns perfectly with what we're hearing. With CNZ's current investment programs, so that's the programs known as Tōtara and Kakatea, we enjoy regular exchanges of information. We catch up informally. We see each other at events. Organisations also share updates with us every 6 months. And then more widely at CNZ, we've been doing some really big engagement projects recently. In 23, we did one that was very broad, and another in 24 that was more closely focused on arts orgs and groups. And so, like, I don't want to rain on this research parade, but none of it was very new to us, to be honest. You know, the insights reflect what we've been hearing for ages. And I mean, all I can do is sort of reinforce how valid all of the points were, and really beautifully presented, though. And it is really helpful to have this in a sort of consolidated piece of research. How it's influencing our approach. Well, because we've been hearing about this for a wee while, we've been working on it for a wee while. You would have seen us making quite drastic changes to what used to be our arts grants program. We reconstructed this into several streams to respond to sector feedback that one size doesn't fit all. So, like, we no longer have, for example, an emerging choreographer competing for funding against a regional arts festival that's been going for years. We've been trying to make applications easier. And we've begun offering support to people who have accessibility needs to remove barriers for them. We've also shifted our focus and are shifting our focus from investing in widgets, activities, to investing in people and time. A really good example of this is how people can now apply for funding towards just time to make art or to evolve their practice, and that being the primary focus, not the sort of output or project itself. And in that feedback we received about what arts organisations need, probably the most common response was stability of multi-year funding. And so that's why we're now developing a model that will enable more arts organisations to seek this kind of support from us. I'm glad to say our latest satisfaction survey results show that those changes have been well received, but we're going to keep on keeping on because there's always more improvements to be made.
Yay. Thanks, Debs. And I think, you know, definitely what we can see with Creative New Zealand is a really active response to what we're hearing and seeing from the sector, and definitely examples of working with partnership, which we can touch on a little bit more. Thank you. Passing to Amber now, you know, speaking from a sort of organizational perspective, what are some of the challenges that, you know, you or, you know, creative sector organizations or Te Pou are facing in securing that more sustainable kind of funding, if we can use the word sustainable at all? And how is Te Pou responding? How are you altering your approach, or what are the things that you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for laying that all out there, Kat. It looks great. And tēnā koe tō kōrero, Debs. Yeah, it's a scary time, isn't it, whānau? It's a bit of a funky time. We've actually, you know, this year, like many other organisations, you know, we're going, oh right, yeah, cool. We don't have Creative New Zealand funding secured past 26, nor Foundation North actually for the first time. We went on to an annual as opposed to 2 years, just because of the funding restrictions that they're seeing. So two of our real, you know, core multi-year funders are undergoing change at the moment. I'm confident, you know, that we will be able to have that kind of we will be able to have longevity of funding afterwards. But it is it is a different time in terms of funding stability. When I was talking to someone at one of at a recent gathering, and it's really it's all any of us want as creative organizations is a bit more funding for a bit longer, really, or a lot more funding for a bit longer, or a lot longer. It's really simple. And I think it's probably the same for any not-for-profit. They just want some security and usually a bit more, because things are always growing and increasing. For us, we're at a particularly important growth phase. So Te Pou has been around for 10 years as an organisation, but at the moment we've just completed 2 years in our newly opened venue. So we've had 2 years of operation. Last year was a real case study for how wonderfully we can operate and how well we can go, because we had a lot of work coming through, a lot of programs that were bolstered by MCH funding that enabled us to deliver quite a large program, large festival, large scale shows coming through our venue. And so we got to see, you know, be able to actually, assess just what we can actually do with that kind of level of funding. And now we just want to see more of that happening within the sector. So what we're finding as a venue is now without that, the funding that was coming through for larger scale projects, and with that impacting other major parts of the landscape, the arts festival, for example, other, you know, key areas in the landscape, we're seeing just how much of a connected ecology we are. We're seeing less companies being able to come through and book, less work being created because of lack of resource across so many areas and parts of this giant, beautiful ngahere, which is our arts ecology. So what we're doing is the way that we're responding is we are continuing to weave together, and seeing as part of a major role of our organisation is to weave together funding in order to invest into independent arts. So whenever anyone comes and presents a show or rehearses at our venue, we subsidise that by 75% of the costs are subsidised by Te Pou. So we only on charge to the artist 25% of what it actually costs to run the venue and to be to have a space for Māori and Pasifika, and for a kaupapa Māori-led performing arts space. So we are continuing to lean into to the need to weave together funding, diversifying those streams and those strands, and holding true to our to accessibility for our artists, for our audiences, deciding not to increase costs in response to this, and trying to really shape our story, mold our story, and write it well and tell it well, like what was on your on their Cat, in terms of the need to tell our story well. That's something that we're working on at the moment, and trying to really strengthen in relationships after we've had these 2 years to say, this is what we're able to do. This is what we're capable of doing. Let's do more of that.
Thanks, Amber. I was really interested in what you said at the beginning about funding stability. We often talk about funding sustainability, but really, the ask for anyone in the sector really is that stability to do what they do more of what they do, because we know you do it well. So thank you.
And we want to employ people. We want to have, 55% of our costs last year went on our staff, went on kaimahi, and these are people who are arts makers, because we're a small country, right? So a lot of our creative, a lot of people who work for our arts companies are also creatives in their own right. We are employing creators when we're employing a producer. We're employing creatives. We're employing Māori creatives when we're employing this person who's running our bookings, or working in our front of house. So we want to be able to know that we can keep employing them year on year. So that stability is so important.
And that importance, I guess, of that money to flow into that creative ecosystem, right? Through the venues and through that work kind of process is really key. It's a challenging time. But Kat, that sort of leads into, what are you seeing beyond the creative sector? These aren't challenges that are unique to the creative sector. The world is a bit turbulent, the pressures are similar. But with the work that you're doing with other sort of not-for-profits, can you speak a little bit more about, the challenges that you're seeing that might be similar, or funders that might be responding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of alluded to this already, that the issues aren't unique, and like Deb said, they're really known for the most part. Like, we know these things in our guts, if not experientially, like we just know. Yeah, the issues aren't any different in different sectors. I think there's just a shortage of money, like period, across the philanthropic sector, and a lot of well, since we did this research, I think the government funding cuts that are happening left, right, and centre are particularly exacerbating the shortage and the increase in demand both at the same time. So philanthropic funders are having to fund, or groups are coming to them in droves looking for things for basic needs, so food, housing. So when you, as a funder, when you're getting inundated with these stuff, and to fund the other things that you were doing before, so there's real pressure in the funding system, and of course organizations are losing government funding as well. So there's just there's a pressure cooker. Also think that a broader trend in philanthropy is funders moving to more outcomes-based funding. So I think historically funders were quite driven to sort of spread funding around. There was often sectoral-based funding, so arts and culture had its own space in that funding ecosystem, whereas when funders become more outcomes focused, there's this kind of inadvertent divestment from arts and culture, unless groups can really show how they're contributing to the kind of outcomes that funders want to see, or their priority communities. And that's a skill that the creative sector is going to have to develop to tell that story. Thankfully, the creative sector is full of good storytellers, so it's sort of hopeful that that can be made possible, but it needs investment and support. I think how nonprofits are responding to the funding landscape is they've gone into fundraising overdrive, like it's just what they have to do. They're cutting back to the core of what they do, rather than the things that make it really impactful, or have better reach, more inclusive. They're just going can we shrink back to the absolute core of what we do? Often over delivering, so doing the same amount with less money. So staff are just volunteering more time, people are burning out. Where people have the bandwidth, there's more advocacy happening, I think, around what's needed, and again, that storytelling of what they're doing. They're moving to diversify the funding streams that they have. There's no other choice. If your funding gets cut from your major funder, you've got to go out and find new resourcing, and some groups stepping into more of an enterprise space to try and generate more of their own direct revenue. But again, that takes time and effort away from the core business to put into that space. So it's really difficult. Our last thing I'll talk about in terms of the response is what funders are doing. So I think, as I said earlier, funders are really aware of all of this stuff. Particularly in the philanthropic spaces and family foundations, community trusts, I think they have more flexibility to try and shift their practice in a way that sometimes local and central government it's harder for. So in those spaces, we're seeing more closed funding application processes and more kind of proactive long-term funding partnerships to try and move away from that competitive funding paradigm that we're all stuck in. We're seeing more funders proactively collaborating and bringing opportunities to each other that kind of fit their purpose. And we're seeing funders move to more innovative types of philanthropy, so more participatory, where communities involved in decision making, and or use devolving funding to intermediaries that know the community better than the funder can when it's national or regional, but across many sectors. So those are really positive changes that we're seeing, but there's still a long way to go. Although there's some innovation, it's going to be slow to become business as usual within the funding landscape. So yeah, it's an ongoing thing.
Thanks, Kat. Just picking up on that sort of slightly more positive potential for positivity, I guess. Within the case study, there were some characteristics of funding relationships that organizations found sort of enabling and desirable, and that really worked for them. This is a question for all three of you. Have you got some examples, or what do you see as makes that good funding relationship? What are some of the core aspects of that we can lean into?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to some great ones. Whether or not to name drop, maybe I'll just talk about some of the aspects of them. But the being able to have a really good human-to-human relationship, and then the positive aspects of that being embedded in that in the funding body, so that the next if they leave, the next person coming through is able to to pick up that same ethos, that same way of having relationship. Is really important. Being able to know that you can that you can have that kind of transparency of conversation, to have a really transparent conversation of, yep, we know what you want to do, we know what you want to do, and we're all in this together. We know there's not enough to go around. Let's just talk, let's talk easily about this. That makes all the difference. We've had some funding relationships recently where it's been more where we've been approached. And we have the first part of the relationship hasn't required too much us having to invest too much time and energy into putting forward what we're doing or what we're wanting to do. It's more of a little short EOI process before you actually get into something that's really detailed, just so that people are aware of what kind of investment is being made when there's no guarantee of success. That's really useful. And we've really enjoyed a reporting process that's been one-on-one, where someone has come and met with our whole team. We've had a funder come and meet with our entire team and have cafe and kōrero about what we do, about what they do. And so that embeds in our organization this idea of we have relationships with these funders. So our 19-year-old new venue technician knows funding relationships are important in this place that he works, and that's something that I'd never had up until last year. So those are interesting progress and changes in relationships that I'm seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Amber. I agree with everything. And I think it's so important to hear the organization's voices on this side rather than the funders. But I mean, we've enjoyed much of the same change, like the changes that we're making are better. Like, I love hearing stories direct from people rather than over them reading reports. And it's always more real if we're in the space, seeing the work, seeing the people. that makes it really rewarding for us. I suppose relationships, I mean, like nobody wants to hear a funder complain about how tough their lives are. But like genuinely, just as funding recipients want to be listened to and respected and understood and have their needs met, you know, so do we. And I think it's just a general good relationships are reciprocal. So the best organisation relationships we have with organisations, they understand that, like them, CNZ staff are humans who are trying to do their best for the arts, and that we're all actually on the same side trying to achieve the same thing. But that we've just got different constraints on us and we, you know, different expectations. But once we can kind of get to that understanding, and I guess the pathway to that understanding is just lots of kōrero. You know, it makes it so much easier then to trust each other, find solutions to problems, be flexible, be adaptable, all of those attributes that have been spoken about positively. And I guess that's just about that doing the work of building the relationship that is just so important. And I mean, I think, Amber, that's a really interesting point about the challenge of like turnover in funders. You know, like you do build relationships with people and then they move on and you've got to start again. I know that's really difficult. But I will also acknowledge that it's probably easy for us to talk about trust and openness and transparency from our end of the power dynamic. That trust has to be earned, and so like that's something that's really big for us. We're really conscious of it, and that's kind of always one of the things that we're thinking about when we're developing these new programs or different ways of working with the sector, is that actually it's kind of on us to be trustworthy as much as it is the funding recipients. We're also really aware that as a funder, we've got part of that relationship is, you know, the expectations on us that the sector has. We know from listening to the sector, orgs expect us to use our position to tell a big story or tell a bigger story about the arts than just who got funded, to enable them to convene and collaborate, to create opportunities to help them grow, to share with them a long-term strategic and ecosystem view, you know, like make the most of our sort of position, seeing across the sector, across the art forms, in a way that ultimately helps artists in their communities. And they also expect us to be doing things like this delicious little forum.
Oh, thank you for making the time and being with us here today and sharing your kōrero, both Amber, Kat, and Debs, all three of you. Kat, do you have anything to add to this? You sort of touched on a little bit before.
Yeah, I'll just note that I've just dropped a resource in the chat. I was involved through my hat with the Centre for Social Impact in a series of research pieces with the J.R. Mackenzie Trust looking into good practice in philanthropy. And the second part of that was a deep dive into what man-enhancing funding partnerships look like, the characteristics of those. There's a great diagram in there and kind of what good relationships look like, and also a series of case studies showing how funders across New Zealand, but also over the ditch in Australia, are actually shifting their practice to try and be more community centered and to actually enable and, you know, provide groups with self-determination in terms of carrying on doing the amazing stuff that they do. So that's really worth checking out if that's an area of interest for you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kat. And kia noi tātou. Whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki, whakataha ai, kia turiki, whakataha ai, homie, huie, tai kie. Ka kite anō.